Your support keeps these stories alive. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell.
My name is Michael. I am 35 years old, and for most of my adult life, I lived with the belief that one day I would inherit my uncle's house. It was not just any house. It was the old family home, a 2-story brick house with green shutters, nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in the town where I grew up. My Uncle George had lived there since before I was born. The house smelled of cedar wood and old books, and for me, it always represented stability, heritage, and a sense of belonging. Uncle George never married and had no children of his own. He was the kind of man who told long stories at family gatherings, stories that blended history with humor, making everyone laugh and roll their eyes at the same time. He was strict, yes, but he had a soft spot for me. Growing up, I was the nephew who helped him mow the lawn, paint the porch, or fix the squeaky hinges on the garage door. He used to ruffle my hair when I was a kid and say, "One day, this will all be yours, kiddo." The first time he said it, I was maybe 12 years old. I remember standing on that front porch with paint on my hands, the summer heat clinging to my shirt. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he looked at me seriously and repeated it. "I mean it, Michael. This house should stay in the family, and you're the one I trust to take care of it." From that day on, the promise wasn't just words. It was a vision of the future. I built my life around the idea that one day I would live in that house. I turned down risky opportunities in other cities because I thought my future was rooted right there. When I went through rough times financially, I told myself it would be worth it in the long run because eventually that house would be mine. It wasn't about greed. It wasn't about money. It was about legacy. That house was more than bricks and mortar. It was the place where my grandparents had celebrated their golden wedding anniversary. It was where I learned to ride a bike in the long driveway. It was where every Thanksgiving and Christmas ended up, even if we started at someone else's place. That house carried our family's history in its very walls. Uncle George reinforced the promise countless times over the years. Whenever family gossip started swirling about inheritances or property, he would chuckle and say, "Well, at least Michael knows where he stands. The house will be his." My cousins would laugh or roll their eyes, but none of them ever contested it. It was simply accepted. George had made his choice, and everyone knew it. But then came the night that unraveled everything. It was a Saturday evening when George invited a few family members over for dinner. I didn't think much of it. He often hosted dinners, though usually they were casual, with paper plates and beer bottles clinking on the counter. This time, however, something felt different. When I arrived, the table was set formally, with candles, polished cutlery, and a roast slowly steaming in the center. And there, sitting at George's right hand, was my cousin, Stephen. Now, Stephen and I had always had a complicated relationship. He was 2 years younger than me, but he carried himself like the world owed him something. He was the type who drifted from job to job, always complaining that life wasn't fair, always expecting someone else to bail him out. I had bailed him out myself a few times, lending him money I never saw again. So when I saw him sitting there, grinning like a cat who had already eaten the canary, I felt an unease settle in my stomach. Something was brewing, though I couldn't yet put my finger on it. The dinner started pleasantly enough. We ate, we laughed at George's old stories, and for a while, I convinced myself I was overthinking. But then, as dessert was being served, George cleared his throat. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, his voice steady but carrying that weight he used when he was about to make an announcement. "About the future, about the house." My heart skipped. I smiled faintly, already expecting the familiar reassurance. But instead, he turned to Stephen. "I've decided to update my will. The house is going to Stephen." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. My fork clattered against my plate, and for a moment I thought I had misheard. The room went quiet, except for the faint ticking of the old clock on the mantel. I stared at my uncle, my mouth dry. "What? What do you mean?" I finally managed to choke out. George sighed, as if he had rehearsed this. "You've always been there for me, Michael, and I'll never forget that. But Stephen's had a hard time finding his way, and I think this house could give him the stability he needs. It's time for me to reconsider what's best for the family. I felt my blood run cold. But you promised me. For years you told me this house would be mine. You told everyone. Stephen leaned back smugly, sipping his wine. Things change, cousin, he said casually, like he had just won a prize he barely deserved. I wanted to leap across the table, to shake George and remind him of every moment I had been there when Stephen wasn't, every hour I had put into maintaining the house, every sacrifice I had made believing in that promise. But all I could do was sit there, my heart shattering, as the foundation of my life crumbled in the space of one dinner. And that night, as I drove home, one thought kept echoing in my mind. How could one promise mean everything for so many years, only to be erased with a single sentence? I don't remember much of the drive home that night. The road blurred past me, headlights streaking through the rain-streaked windshield. But my mind wasn't on the traffic. It was on the dining table, on my uncle's calm voice, and on Stephen's smug little grin. The house that had always felt like a certainty in my future had been ripped from under me with one casual announcement. And what cut deeper than the loss itself was the way it was done. After decades of promises, after years of me shaping my life around his words, George had blindsided me in front of the very cousin who least deserved it. When I pulled into my driveway, I didn't go inside right away. I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, the rage simmering so hot in my chest that I thought I might choke on it. How could he do this? How could one dinner, one decision, erase decades of loyalty? I finally stumbled inside and poured myself a drink, then another, then another. My hands shook as I replayed everything. Stephen's smirk, George's sigh, the sound of my own voice cracking when I said, "But you promised me." It wasn't just about a house. It was about trust, about the way George had looked me in the eye so many times and told me the future was secure. Those promises had guided my choices, shaped my plans, convinced me to stay rooted instead of chasing opportunities in other places. And now, all of that felt like a joke, like I was the punchline to some cruel story. The following morning, I woke with a pounding headache, but the anger hadn't dulled. If anything, it had sharpened overnight. I picked up my phone and called George. He didn't answer. I tried again. Still nothing. By noon, I was at his house, pounding on the door until finally he opened it. He looked older than he had the night before, as if he'd aged 10 years in a matter of hours. His eyes were tired, but his tone was steady when he said, "Michael, this isn't a good time." I pushed past him into the living room. "Not a good time? You drop a bomb like that last night and now it's not a good time?" George sighed, closing the door behind me. "I knew you'd be upset, but I made my decision. It's final." I spun on him, my voice breaking with the force of my anger. "Final? You've told me since I was a kid that this house would be mine. You've said it in front of everyone. And suddenly, over dessert, you just hand it to Stephen, the man who's never lifted a finger for you." George rubbed his temples. "Stephen needs this more than you do. You've built a life for yourself, Michael. You're responsible, steady. But Stephen, if I don't help him now, I don't know if he'll ever find his footing." The words stung like acid. "So I'm punished for being responsible? For doing the right things? While Stephen gets rewarded for being reckless and entitled?" George didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, as though he couldn't look me in the eye. I felt my throat tighten. "Do you even realize what this does to me? You've made me believe for over 20 years that this house was my future. I turned down jobs. I stayed here when I could have gone elsewhere, because I trusted you, and now, with one dinner, you erase all of it." George finally looked up, his face lined with guilt, but also stubbornness. "Maybe I made a mistake in promising you so strongly. Maybe I should have kept it open. But Michael, it's my house, and this is my choice. I have to do what I think is best." I stood there, shaking, the betrayal so raw that I couldn't even speak for a moment. Finally, I said, "Then don't ever talk to me about family again, because family doesn't betray each other like this." I stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. For days afterward, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Stephen smirking across that dinner table. He hadn't even looked surprised because he knew. He must have known before that night, which meant George had been planning this, keeping it from me until the last possible moment. That realization broke something inside me. It wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. I had been played for a fool, and everyone knew it but me. And in that humiliation, a dangerous thought began to grow. If George and Stephen thought they could take away what was mine with one dinner, then maybe it was time I reminded them who had really earned that house. The first time I saw Stephen after that dinner was 2 weeks later. I had avoided him like the plague, but fate has a cruel way of throwing people together. It was at our aunt's birthday party, one of those obligatory family gatherings where pretending to smile is as painful as biting glass. I walked in with a knot in my stomach, and there he was, already holding court near the bar, laughing too loud, bragging too much. I caught just enough of his conversation to make my blood boil. He was telling 2 of our relatives about how Uncle George was finally doing the right thing. When he spotted me, he smirked. That same smug little curl of his lips that had haunted me since that dinner. "Well, if it isn't the former heir," he said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. A few chuckles broke out, and I felt my face burn. I clenched my fists so tight my nails dug into my palms. "Careful, Stephen," I said, my voice low. "You've been handed something you didn't earn. Don't get too comfortable." He leaned in, his breath thick with whiskey. "You're just bitter because you spent your life waiting for scraps. Me? I know how to take what I want." That was it. I shoved him back, hard enough that he stumbled into the bar and nearly knocked over a tray of glasses. Gasps rippled through the room, and suddenly everyone was staring. Our aunt, furious, shouted at me to leave. Stephen straightened himself, grinning like he had won again. Walking out of that party was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Every cell in my body screamed to turn around and finish what I had started. But deep down, I knew a fistfight wouldn't solve anything. Still, that night confirmed something. Stephen wasn't just taking the house, he was taking my dignity. He wanted me humiliated, defeated, erased, and Uncle George was letting him do it. The days that followed were hell. I avoided calls from relatives who wanted the inside scoop. I ignored texts from friends asking why I looked so drained. My job suffered because I couldn't concentrate. My entire identity, my vision of the future had been tied to that house, and now it felt like my very foundation was crumbling. One evening, desperate for answers, I drove back to George's house. I didn't call first. I just showed up. When he opened the door, the look on his face said it all. He knew why I was there. "Michael," he said, his voice weary, "I don't want to fight with you." "Then explain to me," I demanded, "why you're doing this. Why him?" George sighed, ushering me inside. We sat in the living room, the same living room where I had spent countless Christmas mornings. Now it felt like enemy territory. "Stephen needs structure," he said again, the same line as before. "This house could give him that. You're strong, Michael. You don't need it the way he does." I laughed bitterly. "So I'm punished for being strong? For being dependable? That's your logic?" George rubbed his forehead. "It's not about punishing you. It's about trying to save him before it's too late." "Save him?" I snapped. "You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, and you're sacrificing me to do it." He didn't respond. His silence was answer enough. That was the moment I realized the promise he had given me all those years wasn't worth the air it was spoken on. Promises, I learned, are only as strong as the person making them. And George's word, which I had once treated as gospel, had turned to dust. When I left that night, I didn't just feel betrayed, I felt hollow, like a part of me had died in that house. But there was still one thing left inside me, a burning sense of injustice. And injustice, when it festers long enough, transforms into something sharper, determination. If Stephen and George thought they could cut me out of the future of that house, they were wrong. because I wasn't going to walk away quietly. After that last visit with George, I went home and sat in silence for hours. I kept staring at my own reflection in the darkened window, barely recognizing the man looking back. A man who had believed in loyalty, in promises, in family, and had been made a fool of. The rage was still there, but something else had taken root. Resolve. If George wanted to hand everything to Stephen out of pity, then fine. But I wasn't about to let them erase me from the story like I never mattered. I had spent years working on that house. Years being the one person George could count on. And now I would be the one to hold them accountable. The first step was information. I met with a lawyer, explaining the situation as calmly as I could, though I could feel the anger vibrating in my voice. The lawyer listened, nodding slowly, then said, "Look, unless you were financially promised something in writing, your uncle is free to change his will as he pleases, but—" He leaned forward. "If there's any proof that he made verbal promises to you that influenced major life decisions, we might have a case. It's not guaranteed, but it's leverage." Verbal promises. My mind flashed with memories, George telling me over and over in front of relatives, friends, even neighbors that the house would be mine. If half of them were willing to testify, I might be able to build a case. But legal battles weren't the only front I had in mind. I knew Stephen. I knew his weaknesses, his arrogance, his impulsiveness, his complete inability to keep his life in order. If George thought Stephen represented stability, then I was going to prove just how wrong he was. I started digging, quietly, carefully. I spoke to people who had loaned Stephen money, to employers who had fired him, to women he had left behind when things got messy, and the picture that emerged was worse than I imagined. Gambling debts, unpaid loans, a near arrest for driving under the influence. Stephen wasn't just irresponsible, he was dangerous. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. How could George overlook all of this? How could he think this man deserved to carry the family legacy? One night, armed with a folder of everything I had collected, I went back to George's house. He looked surprised to see me, but I didn't give him time to object. I spread the documents out across his dining table, unpaid bills, letters from collection agencies, even a police report. "Take a good look," I said, my voice shaking with intensity. "This is the man you're giving your house to. This is the man you think needs stability. He doesn't want stability, George. He wants a free ride, and you're giving it to him at my expense." George sat there in silence, staring at the papers. His face was unreadable, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. "You've always said I was dependable," I pressed on, "that I was the one you could trust, and now you're punishing me for it. You think Stephen will change because of a house? No. He'll drag it down with him, just like he's dragged down every job, every relationship, every opportunity he's ever been given." Finally, George looked up, his expression pained. "Michael, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll reconsider," I demanded. "Say you'll stop this madness before it's too late." But he didn't. He just sat there, his hands trembling slightly, his gaze locked on the evidence I had laid before him. I left that night without an answer, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had shifted the ground beneath him. Still, deep down, I knew this wasn't over. George might hesitate, he might waver, but Stephen wasn't going to let go that easily. He had tasted victory, and men like him don't back down when there's something to gain. The real fight hadn't even started yet, and I was ready for it. The weeks after I laid those documents on George's dining table were some of the longest of my life. Every day I woke up with a knot in my stomach, waiting for a call, an email, any sign that he had come to his senses. Instead, there was silence. Stephen, on the other hand, was louder than ever. Word got back to me that he was already bragging to friends about the house, telling them how he planned to renovate, how he'd throw parties in the backyard. He spoke as if the ink on the will was already dry. Every time I heard about it, my anger bubbled up fresh. Finally, after nearly a month, George called. His voice was strained, softer than I had ever heard it. He asked me to come over. When I walked into that house, the familiar scent of cedar and old books nearly broke me. How many times had I crossed that threshold believing it was my future? Now, it felt like a place where my fate was on trial. George was waiting in the living room, his will and some papers spread across the coffee table. Stephen was there too, leaning against the mantel with that same smug expression. George gestured for me to sit. His hands trembled slightly as he folded them together. I've been thinking a lot about everything, about the promises I made, about what's best for this family. He took a deep breath, and I've made my decision. The silence stretched so thin I thought it might snap. My chest tightened. George looked first at Stephen. You're my nephew, and I love you. But Michael is right. You've made mistake after mistake, and I can't hand you this house hoping it'll fix you. That's not how responsibility works. Stephen's jaw dropped. Are you kidding me? He shouted. After everything we talked about? After everything you said? George raised a hand. Enough. I was wrong to give you false hope. You need to build stability on your own, not inherit it on a silver platter. Then George turned to me, his eyes tired but resolute. Michael, the house will go to you, as I always promised. I let my doubts cloud my judgment, but I can't ignore who has truly earned it. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Relief flooded through me so hard my hands shook. After weeks of betrayal, humiliation, and anger, justice had been restored. Stephen exploded, pacing the room like a trapped animal. This is unbelievable. You always favored him. You're just rewarding him for kissing up to you his whole life. I stood, finally facing him, with a calm I hadn't felt in months. No, Stephen. This isn't about favoritism. It's about responsibility. It's about showing up, year after year, when it wasn't easy, when there was no reward in sight. That's what family means, something you've never understood. Stephen stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. The house rattled, but inside me, for the first time in weeks, there was peace. Later, when I drove home, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I had won. What I felt was something deeper, vindication. I had fought for the truth, and for once, truth had prevailed. But I also knew this ordeal had left scars. The promise of that house, once so simple and pure, had become tangled with bitterness and betrayal. In the end, I would inherit it, yes, but the cost was the fracture of family bonds that might never heal. That night, I stood outside my small apartment and looked up at the stars. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine the future again. Not the future George had dangled in front of me all my life, but the one I would build brick by brick, decision by decision. And I realized something. A house is just a house. But the fight for it had taught me who I was. I wasn't the nephew waiting for promises. I wasn't the man living in someone else's shadow. I was the one who refused to let betrayal define me. And when the day came that the keys to that house were finally mine, I knew I wouldn't just inherit walls and windows. I would inherit every lesson of this brutal chapter of my life. Because promises can be broken, but determination cannot.